I lived through years of control and humiliation, but I discovered my strength and took back my life. What happened to me that day changed everything. I always thought I had a stable life, that my efforts were recognized, that my routine, though tough, was normal. But when I woke up that morning, I felt something different, a mixture of exhaustion, fear, and a strange clarity. I woke up alone at home, feeling like I could no longer stand the way everything was controlled. My daughter Livia was still asleep, and I looked at her and thought about how I wanted her to have a different life, a life where she didn't have to obey Ottavio's rigid rules to be loved or accepted. I spent hours drinking coffee, trying to organize my mind, but every corner of the house seemed to remind me of how much I had lost myself trying to please. I saw family photos on the wall, and for the first time I didn't feel pride. I felt anger, pain, shame for having allowed my life to be dictated by someone who called himself my partner, but only wanted to control. It was at that moment that I realized I needed to change, that I could no longer postpone this truth. Sitting in the kitchen, I cried, my throat aching from years of swallowing tears. I didn't know exactly how to begin, but I felt a strength I hadn't felt in a long time, as if a part of me had awakened. That morning showed me that I needed to face something I'd been avoiding, the truth about my marriage and my own life. Sitting there, I remembered all the times Ottavio had made me feel inadequate, even when I was giving my all. He always had a ready criticism, a way to make me feel guilty for wanting to rest, for wanting to make my own decisions. I tried to justify everything, to convince myself it was normal, that everyone went through difficult situations at home. But that day, I felt that justification no longer work. I felt the weight of years of submission, of choices that were never mine. I remembered Jonas, my eldest son, who blindly followed his father's orders, reinforcing that silent prison we lived in. And I thought of Livia, so young, with dreams and hopes, and realized that if I didn't change, she would learn to accept that as normal. Anger began to mix with courage. For the first time, I felt I deserved more, that my life couldn't be reduced to obeying someone who only cared about maintaining control. That day, I looked at my phone and thought of Paula, my friend, who always told me I needed to see the manipulation I was experiencing. I was reluctant. I felt guilty for even considering breaking that pattern, but her words echoed in my mind. I felt ashamed that it had taken me so long to realize it, but also enormous relief that I was finally seeing the truth. I took a deep breath and realized that the decision to change wasn't just mine, but also my daughter's. The feeling of being trapped gave me a strange impulse, a mixture of fear and strength. For the first time, I thought, if I don't do it now, it might never happen. And that idea seemed absurd, yet liberating at the same time. I needed to confront what I'd been hiding from myself. Sitting there, I began mentally planning my next steps, knowing it wouldn't be easy, that I would feel pain, fear, and perhaps even rejection, but that I could finally try to regain control of my life. As I gathered my thoughts, my heart raced. I felt a mix of panic and determination. I remembered Nelson, my neighbor, who always watched from the outside and seemed to notice more than I did, and I felt the urge to ask for help. But I also knew I needed to believe in myself, in my strength, first. For years, I had let Ottavio decide everything, from how to spend money to small daily choices, and this was undermining my confidence. Now, I realized that change wouldn't just be about confronting my husband, but about rebuilding my self-esteem, my ability to trust my own voice. The pain I felt at realizing how much time I'd wasted began to mix with a sense of hope. For the first time in years, I thought it might be possible to live differently, without constant fear, without feeling like my choices were invalid. That morning was intense, a whirlwind of emotions, but it was also the starting point of something I never thought I would achieve, taking back my life. I stood up and walked to the mirror, staring at my reflection. I didn't just see a tired woman. I saw someone who had been suffocated, but who was still whole. My body trembled, my hands sweated, and the feeling of fear mixed with courage. I began to talk to myself, quietly, admitting all my flaws, all the times I had failed to put myself first. I admitted that I was afraid, yes, afraid of Ottavio, afraid of my family's judgment, afraid of losing my children, but I also admitted that I was tired of living like this. The clarity I felt in that moment was like a blade cutting through the fog I was living in. For the first time, I felt I could make different choices, that I deserved freedom. I didn't know what it would be like, I didn't know how my husband would react, but that morning showed me that I could start trying. For the first time, hope overcame fear, and I felt that if I had the courage, I could rebuild my life and teach my daughter that being free isn't a luxury, it's a right. After that moment in the mirror, my mind wouldn't stop. I felt my entire body tense, every muscle reminding me of how repressed I was. I remembered how many times I'd stopped myself from doing something I wanted because Ottavio didn't approve. How many times I'd kept quiet to avoid conflict. How many times I'd stayed awake at night thinking about how to please everyone but myself. But that day, something shifted. There was a fire inside me I hadn't felt in years, a desire to assert myself, to show that there was still life outside of his control. I called Paula, my friend, just to hear a friendly voice. She encouraged me, without telling me what to do, but simply by being on the other side, she listened. I cried, laughed nervously, and felt the first pang of real relief. For the first time in a long time, someone believed in me, and that gave me the courage to believe in myself. I spent hours reflecting on my life, my relationship with Jonas, who had always been Ottavio's right-hand man, and I realized how that had made my freedom even more difficult. He seemed so convinced the world revolved around his father that he didn't even see he was suffocating me. That morning showed me that I couldn't wait for anyone to notice my pain. I needed to do something for myself. In the midst of this turmoil, I looked at Livia sleeping and felt a mixture of fear and love. I was afraid she would get lost in rules I'd followed for years, and that gave me strength. Every small gesture, every laugh when she woke, reminded me that I needed to break the cycle of submission that was about to begin. I remembered times when I'd tried to explain my ideas to Ottavio and Jonas, and how I'd always been ignored or ridiculed. Anger surged again, mixed with sadness and accumulated fatigue, but at the same time, I felt determined. I took a deep breath and realized I didn't need to have all the answers right then. The important thing was to take the first step. I wrote in my notebook every thought, every decision I wanted to make, every fear I needed to face. It seemed trivial, but for me, putting my feelings on paper was liberating. I began to understand that recognizing my own voice was the first step toward change. During the morning, my mind also returned to Nelson, my neighbor, who always noticed things I pretended not to. I remembered how discreet yet attentive he had always been, as if waiting for me to see the truth on my own. And I finally saw it. Every comment, every gesture, every attention he gave me fit into that puzzle of years of manipulation. It wasn't just about Ottavio. It was years of pushing my own will aside, of convincing myself that what I felt wasn't relevant. That morning made me realize I could say enough, that I had the right to make choices, to have feelings, to have opinions. The clarity of what needed to be done came suddenly, like a snap, and gave me a sense of urgency. I felt afraid, but I felt strong. For the first time, I felt I wasn't alone, even if I faced a lot of resistance. It was time to start, however small, however painful. By mid-afternoon, my head was a mess, but my heart began to calm. I remembered all the little moments Ottavio had humiliated me, always disguised as care or concern. I remembered how he constantly manipulated my choices, using guilt and fear as tools to keep me trapped. I remembered the rage I felt when I realized all my efforts, all my work, were never recognized, and how invisible it made me feel. And yet, that afternoon, something inside me began to shift. I realized that the value of who I am doesn't depend on his approval, but on my own conscience. The feeling was liberating and frightening at the same time. I began to breathe differently, realizing that I could still decide. I could still choose. I understood that the freedom I sought wouldn't come suddenly, but the first step was recognizing that I was worth fighting for. Late that afternoon, I looked at my daughter and realized I was about to change not only my life, but her future as well. There was fear, of course. Fear of what Ottavio might do. Fear of my children's judgment. Fear of what would happen if I failed. But fear no longer paralyzed me. It simply reminded me of the importance of what I was doing. I felt anger and courage at the same time, pain, but also hope. For the first time in a long time, I felt I could win. My determination was firm, and I knew that afternoon marked the beginning of my break with everything that imprisoned me. I felt clarity, strength, and an energy I hadn't felt in years. The certainty that I could finally reclaim my life, my voice, and my right to be happy. As night began to fall, my body felt exhausted, but my mind more alert than ever. I sat in the living room, under the dim light of the lamp, and realized how many times I'd accepted small humiliations and manipulations, thinking they were normal. Every detail of the house seemed to remind me of the years I'd spent trying to please Ottavio, of the plans I'd postponed, of the desires I'd suppressed. But in that moment, the feeling was different. It wasn't just pain or anger. There was clarity, and with it, the strength of someone who had decided not to surrender anymore. I thought about my children, about Jonas, who faithfully followed his father, and about Livia, who still had time to learn that she could be the master of her own life. I realized that if I didn't start, no one would start for me. It was time to make a concrete decision, even if it hurt, even if I was afraid. Feeling afraid was never a problem. The problem was never taking action. I grabbed my notebook and wrote down plans, ideas, small actions that could break me out of that cycle of submission. It was there, in that silent room, that I realized the extent of my own strength, something I had forgotten existed. As I wrote, a mix of emotions hit me intensely. Pain, guilt, anger, and fear mingled with courage, determination, and hope. I remembered all the times I felt invisible, all the times I tried to speak and no one listened. But now, the need to be heard by myself and my children was greater than any fear. For hours I wrote, planned, thought through every detail, weighing risks and consequences. The feeling that I was about to change everything was overwhelming, but at the same time, liberating. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't just surviving, but beginning to truly live. That moment became a turning point, a point at which I realized my life no longer needed to revolve around Ottavio's control. Amidst this reflection, I remembered Paula and how crucial her friendship was in helping me see reality. She never told me what to do, but she showed me that I could trust myself. I remembered the conversations, the looks, the words that made me feel I deserved more. I felt gratitude and pain at the same time. Gratitude for having someone who supported me, pain at realizing how much time I had wasted. But I realized that the past couldn't stop me from moving forward. Every memory, every humiliation, and every feeling of suffocation became fuel for my transformation. It was there, in that silence of the night, that I realized my freedom depended on no one but myself. The physical tension also began to show. My body ached from repressing my feelings, my hands trembled, my stomach churned with anxiety, but my mind remained focused. I remembered the silent arguments, the times I felt guilty for no reason, the decisions made by me and for me without my consent. Now, all of this was transformed into clarity and strength. For the first time, I could feel anger without fear, frustration without guilt, and hope without anxiety. I realized that my fight wasn't just against Ottavio, but against years of underestimating my own voice. When I looked at Livia before bed, I felt an intense mix of love, fear, and determination. I wanted her to have freedom, to know how to assert herself, to refuse to accept what I had accepted. And I realized that to teach this, I needed to start with my own example. The decision was no longer theoretical. It was practical. In that moment, I realized that any fear of rejection, conflict, or judgment was less than the need to free myself and show that it was possible. I felt strength coursing through my body, the certainty that change began there, in that moment, with small actions, but with great impact. The next morning, I woke with my body heavy, but my mind alert. I knew that day would be different, that my choices would have to start being my own, even if small. I took a long shower, trying to cleanse more than just my skin. I wanted to wash away the feeling of years of pent-up submission, fear, and anger. Every movement seemed to symbolize something greater, a way of preparing myself to face the reality I'd been avoiding. As I dressed, I felt adrenaline rushing, mixed with anxiety. It wasn't just about facing Ottavio. It was about facing my own weakness and discovering that I had the strength to fight back. I thought about Jonas, how he blindly followed his father, and I felt anger, but also clarity. My life could no longer be controlled by fear, and if I didn't set an example for Livia, who would? That morning, I began putting plans into action. I called Paula, explained how I felt, and agreed on some steps with her that would give me the confidence to move forward. Feeling someone by my side, even if distant, gave me courage. For years, I had convinced myself I was alone, that my opinions didn't matter, that my voice wasn't relevant. But now, With each step, I felt the strength of my own decision. I wrote down strategies, small actions that would allow me to reclaim my space, from reorganizing my household chores to preparing my mind for inevitable confrontations. Each list, each plan, each detail made me feel alive, in control of myself. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I didn't need to wait for permission to exist or make decisions. As I sipped my coffee, I looked at Livia and thought about her future. I realized that if I didn't change my stance, she would learn to accept control as the norm, just as Jonas had. This thought pained me, but it also energized me. I began to clearly see the pattern of manipulation I'd lived through for years. Ottavio controlled every decision, every moment, but now I saw where my choices could always be mine. I felt an intense mix of anger and clarity. For the first time, my anger felt righteous, directed, and unparalleled. Every memory of criticism, of small humiliations, of decisions that stripped me of my autonomy, became fuel for my transformation. The feeling of rediscovered power was new, strange, but necessary. Mid-morning, I sat alone in the backyard, breathing deeply, trying to organize my thoughts. I remembered all the nights I cried in secret, the times I tried to talk and was ignored, the decisions that were made without my consent. And for the first time, I felt I had control over my choices. It wasn't absolute control, but it was the beginning. I felt afraid of what Ottavio might do, of the resistance I would encounter, but I also felt clear that any consequence was better than continuing to live trapped. I remembered Nelson and the discreet way he always perceived my reality, and I felt gratitude. Knowing that there were people outside who believed in me gave me an invisible but real foundation. That afternoon, I began mentally preparing to confront Ottavio. It wasn't an outburst of anger, but a firm determination. I reorganized my routine, planned what I would say, how to maintain my posture, how to prevent Jonas or anyone else from reinforcing the old cycle of submission. I felt a mixture of nervousness, fear, and strength. Every movement was charged with purpose. For the first time, I realized that change didn't come from outside. It came from within. I needed to believe that I deserved to be heard, that I deserved respect, that I deserved to make decisions. This clarity was painful because it forced me to face years of submission, but also liberating because it showed me that I could rebuild my life. The feeling of starting to fight for myself was frightening, but also exhilarating. When I finally arrived at night, my body felt exhausted, but my mind was more alert than ever. The entire day had been a whirlwind of emotions: fear, anger, anxiety, but also clarity and strength. For the first time in years, I felt in control of my life, even if it was still a fragile and newfound control. I sat in the living room, looking at my children, thinking that the life I wanted for them began with me. Every choice I made that day, however simple, carried weight. Every small act of autonomy was a victory. I no longer needed to hide, no longer needed to accept silent manipulation or impose decisions. For the first time, I realized that my voice had value and that I could use it to shape my life. In the silence of the night, I thought about Ottavio and Jonas. I was afraid of what might happen, afraid of confrontation, afraid of what the change would do to the family dynamic. But I felt an enormous clarity. I could no longer live as a spectator of my own life. I needed to act. I needed to assert myself. I needed to reclaim what had been denied me for so long. This realization gave me courage. It wasn't an impetuous courage, but a conscious, calculated courage that came from the certainty that if I didn't face it, no one would do it for me. I felt a mixture of tension and relief, as if a part of me was finally breathing, after years of suffocation. As I reflected on the day, I also felt an immense gratitude. Gratitude for Paula, for Nelson, for my daughter who inspired me, and even for myself, who finally dared to believe in my own strength. Every tear shed, every sleepless night, every repressed feeling became fuel for my transformation. The pain didn't disappear, but it gained purpose. I felt I was learning to cope with it, to use anger and fear as engines, not chains. For the first time, hope didn't seem fragile. It seemed real, tangible, and possible to experience with every choice. Before going to sleep, I looked at my reflection again. I saw a tired woman, yes, but also strong, determined, and aware that she could rebuild her life. I remembered all the moments I doubted myself and realized that they don't define who I am. They define who I was. And that was enough to keep going. I felt that, even if the path was long, painful, and full of challenges, I was ready. For the first time, I felt like I didn't need to ask permission to exist or be happy. For the first time, I realized that true strength lay within me, not in pleasing, obeying, or submitting. Today, I still feel the weight of everything I've experienced, but I also feel the lightness of someone who has begun to break free. I know the process isn't over, that I will still face fear, anger, and resistance, but now I know I can handle it. My turning point came that day, when I realized my life no longer needed to be dictated by anyone. I began to act, to speak, to choose, and that changed everything. Today, I can say that I am finally finding my voice, my freedom, and my strength. And if I could take that first step, anyone can.